Welcome to the Healing My Parts podcast, a podcast dedicated to educating and raising awareness about dissociative identity disorder, also known as DID. We are your hosts, the system behind Healing My Parts, which also includes parts that function as a therapist and leader in a mental health niche space. We'll be sharing tips and tools that have helped us and many others, while also sharing insights from our own journey of living with the condition. We'll also be hosting guests for conversations to help educate, dispel myths, and most especially help those living with dissociative identities and professionals who treat the condition. Thank you so much for tuning in. And now, let's get healing. Welcome to episode 11 of Healing My Parts podcast. We are your hosts, the system behind Healing My Parts, and we are beyond excited to welcome Dr. Jamie Marich, Jamie Plus, and also known as the Unicorn System, to the show today. We have been getting to know each other for the better part of a year, maybe closer to a year and a half now. And I know I have really enjoyed building the connection, nurturing a friendship. And I know that you all are going to absolutely love Jamie Plus and all that we have in store for you today. So I'm going to let them say a little bit more about what they would like you to know about them. So welcome to the show, Jamie.
Thank you so much for having us. So yeah, you hit on a lot of the identities we're known by. I like to say Dr. Jamie Marich is very much our professional part. She was bound to get a PhD, but she kind of existed before Dr. Jamie Marich as the superwoman, the hero child, which is a part that a lot of our systems who may be listening can relate to having. Jamie Plus is who we use to represent very much the just us, who is a person that is really kind of cynical about a lot of the field in which we find ourselves working. And Jamie and the collection of our various parts, who we like to use the name the Unicorn System now with people who are in the know and get what that means. We speak very candidly and very freely. So officially, we were diagnosed with dissociative disorder NOS in 2004. Right now, if you were diagnosing our latest episode, which happened in 2016, OSDD type 1 would probably be where we'd fit diagnostically. But we simply describe ourselves these days as a person, a system with dissociative identities, because for us, it has never felt right to want to send the parts away or to integrate us in any way. We do relate very, very much to what a lot of our family with dissociative, meaning family of choice with dissociative identity disorder, DID, go through. And the reason we like the identifier person with dissociative identities is it fits for a lot of OSDD systems. It fits for a lot of DID systems. So the metaphor we use in our writing is the car or the body bus, the van, that 44, almost 45-year-old adult Jamie is the one who's driving the car. And even that part, though, can shapeshift between Jamie and Dr. Jamie and some blend of the two. And we have a whole collection of folks on board with us, most notably 4, 9, and 19, which are parts that chronologically formed when we were those ages, and they still stay around that age state for us. Yet they've had a lot of healing. They've had a lot of their own EMDR, and they exist as different entities than we were when we were actually 4, 9, and 19. But yeah, that's a little bit of us.
Thank you. When you actually just were talking about the different parts, it probably would be great to pause momentarily just to help people understand a little bit more about littles, right? Because I have been finding that certainly people that work in the field and are learning to work with people who have dissociative identities seem to expect to find an actual 4-year-old,
right? Versus
a 4-year-old who is a 4-year-old but has been 4 years old for 40 years, which is a little bit different, right? Than your 4-year-old.
Yeah. And that's a great question. And that's one of the reasons, despite some of the controversies with it, we've taken to using AI art or artificial intelligence art to help us map our system these days. Because yes, we can look at pictures of ourselves when we were chronologically 4 or 5. And we remember now what things were like back then with some good clarity, but that's no longer how she feels in us these days. That yes, she still has a lot of the likes and dislikes and needs of a 4-year-old. And she's the one who really keeps us honest about our inner child and about needing to take care of our inner child. She has had a lot of healing. And so she looks and feels different to us than we actually did at 4. Yet we have never felt that it has been an honest part of healing to just have her go away or to just have her grow up or to have her just integrate. But we treat her as a passenger along with us. And yeah, hope that helps.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I've just been noticing confusion mostly amongst professionals, less so of, folks who share dissociative identities. I think we all sort of understand how they work. I can't imagine not having mine because I feel like they bring a lot of joy and creativity even to my work. They're the ones that think of the really fun things to do with clients that
Yes.
some of the more getting shit done parts might struggle with the fun aspects of
Right.
helping folks.
And I remember this was many years ago now, pretty closely to when we first came out. And when we came out very fully in 2018, we committed to being an open book to professionals asking us questions, even if they may seem like stupid questions on the surface or ignorant questions. And even when this one professional asked me this question, several of my colleagues were just downright offended that they would even ask me this question. And I say, it's fine. Like, this is, I'm willing in most contexts to put myself. Anyway, she asked, why would you still want to hang on to that 4-year-old part? Now that you know how to heal and you've had so much EMDR, surely you would know how to integrate her or have her grow up. So why would you still want her hanging around? And our short answer was, she is our power source for joy and light as this inner child. And in a lot of our teaching, we amplify and normalize how many people out there, even folks without dissociative identities, have used the inner child language. And it's not that far off from an inner child. She's just very real to us.
Mm-hmm.
And it would feel like tossing our own kid out of the car at this point. And that's not cool. And she, even though she has been the source of a lot of grief and strife, especially when we're not listening to her, that's the key. It's when we're not listening to her,
yes,
that she can, quote unquote, act out or cause us problems. But we had a really, really huge episode in 2016 going into 2017. We write about it in Dissociation Made Simple. This is not news. And when we re-enter treatment in that period of our life, the big lesson of it was listen to them, listen to the parts, because they will tell you what you need and what is bothering you and what's going on in your life.
I have to just tell you, when you said the person asked, why would you want or around? Why wouldn't you? This visceral internal reaction of somebody squeezing my heart.
Yeah.
That it's just a devastating thought, honestly.
Because I think, and this is going out to our professionals out there listening who want to be allies, who want to do this treatment work. But this is what I think a lot of people without direct lived experience don't quite get. And I'm happy to do my best to try to explain it. There is this association that the parts cause the problems. Even though there's been a lot more normalization, a la no bad parts in the IFS community, many professionals I interface with seem to have this connection that the parts are the ones acting out. The parts are the ones using substances, self-injuring, engaging in disordered eating. And in the case of our system, yes, that's been true at points in the past. And I think if we're not actively working to meet their needs and heal them and listen to them, they could act out again, potentially. Yet, as we write in so much of our work in Dissociation Made Simple, parts exist to meet a need or to protect or both. And sometimes there's some subtle other reasons that they exist. They're not the problem. The trauma is the problem, as so many Dissociation Made Simple contributors say. And so even though, yes, the parts may have been responsible for some behaviors that have caused us problems, they are not the problem.
Absolutely. And to my knowledge, pretty much every part in the system is a benevolent part with good intentions to help, even though, right, they sometimes might be slightly misguided in how they're trying to help at times.
Mhm.
But they learn just like people learn,
Agreed.
especially when you get to that place of being able to communicate internally more fluidly, collaborate, cooperate.
I will say they can learn. Admittedly, some could be more stubborn than others, right? Let's be honest.
Yes. Okay. Yes, for sure.
And
I wouldn't know anything about that. No.
I wouldn't know we wouldn't know anything about that either. Yet we will say on this topic that our 9-year-old part, nine, as we call her in a lot of our writing and work, who has traditionally been the one that has been, she's kind of standing back right now, like, watch what you say. At times in our past, she's been the one responsible for our self-destruction or flirtation with self-destruction, suicidal ideation, behaviors, self-injury. She's probably had the most EMDR of all of us inside. And she now exists as this badass who just kind of looks over everything with her arms akimbo. And she very much, because we don't have, I think, what's traditionally stereotyped as a protector, because they all kind of have worked together to protect us. She's the one who's really able to call bullshit on a lot of what happens around us. So in this place of healing, she's still edgy, she's still snarky, she could still get hurt, but she's still her in this more evolved, healed state now. She really does. We just think the world of her and what she does for us and our system.
That's one thing that I wish people who don't live with dissociative identities could understand, that there is such an incredible relationship between parts. I mean, admittedly, still working on some of those relationships for sure internally in our own system over here. But the reality is, when I think about work, for example, I couldn't actually do my job without the parts that show up for it.
No.
For us, it isn't just one part that shows up as a therapist or one part that shows up as a leader. It's different parts that have different skill sets that come together and kind of move in and out as needed.
Yeah.
So sometimes when people are like, oh, well, won't it be great when you're just one you and you don't have all of these parts? I'm like, actually, it sounds relatively devastating.
Agreed. And that's an interesting topic you're bringing up, because a lot of us who are systems, who are therapists, people will ask us, does just one you show up for work? I will say, or we will say, in our clinical work, we're actually usually there as Jamie, because the folks who want to work with us clinically at this point do, because we have lived experience. And so we're there as Jamie, and the parts are always giving us kind of feedback, and that really helps us do our work. Now, when we show up in some conference spaces, obviously we know Dr. Jamie Marich helps our foot get in the door. And I will give Dr. Jamie Marich credit that she's the one who could show up and get stuff done on days when Jamie doesn't want to go to work. But we have an agreement with each other that who's ever driving, we let her drive, yet we will listen to what you have to say as we're driving. And then we take these road trip breaks more often than we used to really kind of get a sense of what everybody's saying. And I love how you post in your content how every system is different, every system is unique. And I just like that we have these questions, especially as plural therapists.
Yes. I'm so grateful to you for coming out publicly, because I think a number of things. I think that mental health is so highly stigmatized within the field amongst professionals.
Oh, yeah.
And it's taken forever. I mean, I think substance use disorders, right? Those clinicians have been the first ones to really come out and be like, yeah, I'm in recovery.
Yep.
And that became accepted. And then very slowly, you see that kind of filtering into other diagnoses. Anxiety and depression, I don't know that really has much stigma attached to it anymore because it's so widespread. And I remember 24 or so years ago, a little more than that, in the eating disorder field, it was completely taboo to come out as being in recovery or struggling with an eating disorder. And now, everybody, not everybody, but 90-something% of the people probably who are working in the field have some history of an eating disorder. And finally, I think because of your bravery and some other folks who have come behind you, it allowed people like me to come out recently at the national conference that we hosted.
Yay.
And, was met with a lot of support with, I mean, I did see one person in the background mouthing, "Oh my God, no way." But other than that, it was profoundly a positive experience. And I don't know that that would have necessarily been my experience 10 years ago without your courage and bravery.
So, yes. Oh, thank you. Interesting you mentioned the recovery field or the substance use disorder field, because that was our first. I don't ever felt we had to come out about that. It was just always known, because we got sober in 2002, started graduate school in 2003. Now, I will reflect on this, especially with our first few jobs being in the substance use disorder field. It's second nature to self-disclose there. And then when I started working more on the mental health dual treatment side of things, there was a bit of this, you may want to dial it back with talking so much about your lived experience. And in a lot of ways, I felt like the mental health field, even though they were technically more educated and more credentialed in a lot of ways, was really behind the curve with, oh my God, you're talking about that kind of stuff. So yeah, we largely kept our mouth shut about the fact we had no problem disclosing we were a trauma survivor, yet there's a lot of things that could mean. And as we share in Dissociation Made Simple, our coming out about being a person with dissociative identities, despite being diagnosed in 2004 and our whole world making sense when we were diagnosed, it was a slow process. We would dip our toe in the water when we felt safe enough in certain settings. And in our first book, it was very much, we have dealt with a lot of complex trauma and dissociative symptoms as a result. And then circa 2014, if we were in a workshop in a safe enough space, or what we perceived as a safe enough space, we would mention that we live life having been diagnosed with a dissociative disorder or actively having a dissociative system. And as I write in Dissociation Made Simple, a person came up to me after one such workshop and had that mouth gape that you talked about. I can't believe a presenter was up there talking so openly about having dissociative disorders. And I couldn't tell if she was complimenting me or shaming me.
Right.
It was just this sense of, but I knew, I think it wasn't until then that I fully realized how radical this would be to come out, because I teach courses. I actually teach a CE course twice a year on navigating self-disclosure, because a lot of people see me as this advice source about it. So I put a course together. In that, I talk about an early influence on me was Kay Redfield Jamison, who came out as bipolar in 1995. She wrote the book An Unquiet Mind, and we read that at the beginning of our career and were just blown away. And I think we were expecting everybody to be like that.
Wishful thinking.
Like, nope, this was definitely not the norm. But yeah, I'm certainly not the first. Yet, having had that realization, that 1995 until really now, we're seeing this, and it's not just with dissociative disorders. I think a lot of other people with conditions like schizophrenia, thought disorders, mood disorders, eating disorders are, and then certainly folks who are neurodivergent. And there's a lot of pushback about that being like autism being a disorder, even though the DSM says it that way. And I'm drawing a lot of inspiration from people with neurodivergence being like, hey, here we are.
Yep.
So yeah, I hope we're in the middle of a revolution here, because the field certainly needs it.
I think every human needs it too. We all need to know that we're not alone in what our experiences are. And certainly I laugh now when I think back to attending the Healing Together conference for the first time 2 years ago, where I was convinced I was the only clinician living like this, and then logging into their chat and choose for lunch, because I did it virtual the first year.
Right.
And there's like screens of people in the clinicians living with dissociative identities. And it was mind blowing, incredibly affirming, and probably one of the best experiences and life-changing experiences that I've had.
And it's so interesting you say that, because when we came out, and granted, our experience has largely been OSDD. We knew we weren't the only one. Yet we also grew very concerned by the way we heard dissociative disorders talked about. And so that was our main reason for deciding to fully come out in 2018. And at that point, especially in the EMDR community, we had a little bit of established privilege having written 2 books already, known as a trainer. And I just felt I had to pop out and say, surprise to my fellow EMDR trainers, watch who you're talking about. And we also had that experience. We feel the need to say this. In 2015, we fully came out as bisexual. Again, it wasn't really news to us because we had come out to ourselves many years earlier. We came out to the people who really mattered the most in our lives, including our partners and our close friends. We came out to certain professionals if we felt safe. And we knew that to come out fully and publicly, we'd have to come out to our conservative family. So that was a challenge, yet we decided it was worth it. But even in that container or that context, I should say, being bisexual, a lot of people don't realize who they're talking to, especially since a lot of bisexual women are married to men and a lot of bisexual men are married to women. Yep. And I'd be at conferences and hear these microaggressive comments around me about queer people, gay people. And it's like, do you know who you're talking to? And then I'd often spill the beans in a one-on-one conversation. And then, oh, I didn't realize it. I just said, we got to do that with all of our identities here. Because people say shitty stuff who have licenses behind their name, and that's not cool.
It's a little jaw-dropping at times because you make the assumption that people who have licenses who work in the mental health field at the very least are open-minded and non-judgmental, and then you find out that is not necessarily the case.
That is definitely not necessarily the case.
It's damaging. You know, people don't realize how damaging some of those passive aggressive and microaggressions are to the people around them and how that it just filters down into their caseload. Like their clients are suffering from that and they don't recognize that.
I think their clients are suffering from it, and the people that they may be supervising or training or consulting are suffering from it.
Amen. That's very true, actually.
Because I almost have I could have a full to the gills consulting practice right now with people, because the little bit of consulting I'm able to do, it's largely people coming to me saying, I heard this and that didn't seem right. And I said, good on you for identifying.
Yeah.
I think I recently did a TikTok, Instagram about, I heard that if a person comes knowing about their system and talking about their parts, that should be a red flag that they really just have borderline personality disorder and they're not DID, because only we as sacred professionals with our instruments could diagnose somebody as DID. And that is the biggest crock of shit. Sorry, I hope we can swear on this. And yeah, that's an idea in the EMDR community that has been really passed down by a lot of trainers and consultants, especially those who tend to adhere to theory of structural dissociation. And I'm not saying everybody who adheres to theory of structural dissociation believes that. But that's something I routinely challenge when I hear it. And it just makes me sad that people who have a microphone are still saying that, because I think it's ableist. I think it's not taking lived experience into account and what the community actually has to say about that.
It's insane. We don't question people who walk into our offices and say, I'm really anxious. I think I have an anxiety disorder. Or I'm really depressed. I think I have depression.
Mm-hmm.
There is no therapist that I know of who says, well, if you come in knowing your diagnosis, you must have a different diagnosis, which also further stereotypes that other diagnosis, right?
Correct.
Which I think you pointed that out in your TikTok, in your reel, that it's all trauma related.
Well, yeah. I said in the TikTok, I said in the earlier, it's by no means meant to impugn folks with borderline personality disorder, because it's all trauma.
Right.
It's all trauma. Yet I think that still shows the shaming that if you're borderline, you're just attention seeking. Because let's go there. Because another big criticism that I've heard is people who talk about their DID, whether it's on TikTok, whether it's in their blogs, whether it's with their family, or that they're just attention seeking because if you're really DID, you're so full of shame, you would never talk about it. And that's another narrative I've really challenged, this shame as a diagnostic criterion that, yeah. But let's go to their attention seeking.
Yes.
And I believe I've said this online too, that there's a whole profession these days called an influencer. Attention seeking is not unique to people with mental illnesses, whether it be DID, borderline personality disorder, that I think so many of us are craving and yearning for attention. I don't think that's anything that should be inherently shamed, nor again is it anything that is unique to these diagnoses.
Isn't needing attention just part of being human? Isn't that part of why we have relationships and we're not all hermits living somewhere in the wilderness completely isolated?
Right. And I think a lot of, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie, there might be some less helpful attention seeking that I've engaged in. I'll call myself out first, that I see others on social media perhaps engaging in. But then it goes to how much of this is what the culture is promoting? Because
Yeah.
this is a culture where we can all feel so lost, especially, and I'm not anti-social media because I think a lot of good things have happened on social media with leveling the playing field of knowledge and allowing community to be created. But again, we're in this culture now where we support professions of people who are influencers.
Yeah.
So let's look at it in a larger context here, folks.
Absolutely. I want to jump back to that whole shame as a criteria for a diagnosis thing for a quick sec because it
Oh,
is
yeah. Yep.
kind of everywhere.
Yep.
One of the things, that always stands out, I mean, there's a number of things that stand out for me about that, and I won't talk very long. But one thing is, it is easy for shame to be there when you are not connected with anyone else like you.
Yes.
When you think you're the only person who is in a position, whether it's you have DID and you're a therapist, but you don't know other therapists who are in that position, or you just have DID, OSDD, and you just don't know anyone else who is living like you, it is easy to get steeped in shame and to feel embarrassed. But as soon as you get information about it, and God bless social media for bringing that to people, in all honesty, that shame dissipates pretty rapidly.
Agreed. Yes. And that was a lesson I learned in addiction recovery first. And so it's just second nature to me that would apply to mental health. It's also a lesson I learned as a queer person who grew up religious, that yes, shame. I know Brene Brown has used this teaching. I've seen it attributed to a few other people as well, but shame dies when stories are told.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, I don't know why we even have to discuss this. Like, to me, it's just
Thank you
so
for saying that.
commonsensical, but it doesn't seem to be in a lot of people's minds.
There's such an interesting dynamic, I think, in this field, particularly when it comes to DID and OSDD. And that is, it feels like there's this faction of professionals who are like, I don't really understand why including people with lived experience is even important. Right?
This is why it's important.
There's so many reasons, like the nuances of what it's like to live with a condition are completely missed when you're just coming at it from a theoretical perspective and you don't have any input.
And I think part of the elitism, which this is the outgrowth of especially white male supremacy and the academic institutions that have guided the Western creation of this field. And I always say it's important to highlight Western psychology.
Yes.
That started with Freud, because psychology and healing is not new to European countries and America in the last 2 centuries. Anyway, I could go on and on. Why it is important is I think we have been socialized to see experts, to see white coats as the people who know best. And this is also a story I share in Dissociation Made Simple. Even our first ever professional training we ever had on dissociation. So we were diagnosed in 2004. We were doing this EMDR and dissociation training in 2006, and we were sitting back listening to the trainer. And our gut level reaction was, she is making this way harder than it needs to be. But who are we? We're just the sick one here. She's the expert. We really need to be able to listen and take this in. And to show you how strong the fawn response flowed through us, even after the talk, we went up to her and just thanked her for educating us and et cetera, et cetera. And then years and years of sitting through more trainings like that, we felt more emboldened to call bullshit on a lot of what the professional establishment has taught about dissociation. Because I know that, and I say this in my writing, I say this in Association Made Simple. I've even acknowledged it in some recent TikToks. I do have gratitude to a lot of the academic establishment for the heavy lifting they've done around research, especially validating the existence of DID, because we know that the larger field of psychology and medicine can be less hospitable.
Isn't that the truth?
Yet, yes. And so thank you for playing your part, especially because someone like me with lived experience, our research wouldn't be taken seriously by the man that I just described. Yet, research doesn't bridge to clinical practice always. And proving that something exists and that constructs are valid in research does not necessarily connect to the nuance of lived experience, which you can only ascertain by actually asking people about their lived experience.
And understanding, right, that lived experience is really vast.
Yes.
That's the thing that I'm noticing is really missed, especially by, I'm so glad that there are so many more clinicians that are interested in learning how to treat and how to support people who have dissociative identities, but there's definitively a misunderstanding about what the experience is like and what, for example, what is amnesia? How do we define amnesia? Because if you stick to the only definition as being somebody who wakes up in a situation and doesn't know how they got there, that is not the only way that that's experienced by people.
And yeah. And to this discussion, I will shed light on this. When we started coming out, there was somebody who's pretty well known in the dissociation establishment who we had started a connection with that essentially told us no one will take us seriously if we keep talking only from lived experience. And this person tried to caution me that when folks tried to do that in the past, we were told by the larger scientific medical community, we need numbers, we need hard evidence, that lived experience is not that. And I do think a lot of that is the sad reality of the culture in which we find ourselves, where numbers are elevated as, if it can't be measured in numbers, then it's not real, it's not true. If it can't be measured by hard science, and I always specify hard science because science just means the acquisition of knowledge. And this might be that I am a long neglected qualitative researcher. And so much of even my coming up in my academic training was, oh, you're a qualitative researcher? That's cute. That was kind of the air we were treated with, that it's nice to have it, yet people need to be shown with hard evidence, with numbers, in order to believe in something. And that makes us sad, but we also know that's a lot of the world we're still living in.
It frustrates me so much when sometimes when we're validating treatments, right this minute, I'm actually thinking of the eating disorder field where, for the longest time, like CBT was the gold standard. And yet the recovery rates were abysmal. They are not impressive. They still actually aren't that impressive. They're certainly better than they were. And people miss the importance of just what it's like to be an individual living with the disorder, whichever one you might be diagnosed with, taking into consideration your gender, your sexual identity, your culture, your race, and all of the variations and nuances of what needs to constitute treatment with all of those different variables, socioeconomic status, et cetera. There's so many things that we have to individualize. And when you look only at hard numbers research, those hard numbers research, it doesn't translate into how you need to be able to bend and flex in your delivery of care. Most research is not done, right, for people who are living in poverty. Most research is not done on females. Most research is not done on Black folks. There's so many people that are left out of research, but those are the people we treat.
Yes. And I think a lot of therapies like CBT are just easier to research with numbers, and other therapeutic work that requires more nuance And on this topic, speaking of Kay Redfield Jamison, we just started reading this weekend her newest book called Fires in the Dark, which is a retrospective of healing arts and doctors and nurses and therapists that have kind of been not very well known by history, and it's great. We're still reading it, so await a full review. Yet something we underlined in her introduction is that therapeutic techniques come and go, but the conditions, the human condition, the needs of humans remain pretty constant. And in a lot of ways, I get concerned when our field is so hell-bent on, well, what technique is going to work the best by numbers, especially, versus how do we really get to know that person who's in front of us?
Somewhere along the way, it seems to me that therapy, the definition of therapy somehow changed, or maybe also the training of new grads has changed. Like one of the things I've noticed in interns that come in is many of them, not all of them, but many of them have this idea that therapy is a conveyor belt of interventions that you just plug in.
Yes.
And they sort of don't seem to know that therapy is a relationship between two people. And in the context of that relationship, there's rupture, there's repair,
Yes.
there's attachment stuff that gets played out, there's the countertransference, transference, all that stuff. In addition to, yes, we can work on specific behaviors, but therapy is not just let's get rid of X behavior.
The conveyor belt of interventions. But I think that's what insurance and our systems that we work for want it to be. Because I even have learned so many lessons about myself as a therapist with feeling the peer pressure to make someone better.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when I got trained in EMDR and became a specialist in EMDR. And here, fix this person is a lot of the either overt or implied tone around things, as opposed to get to know this person, especially when you do feel like you only have so many sessions you can work with.
Yes, true. And today, thankfully, for folks who are using insurance, at least most of the insurance companies have stopped putting a limit on individual
Good.
therapy, right? Which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And I think back to earlier works in the 90s of like Jean Baker Miller, Irene Stiver, Healing and Connection, The Way Women Heal, where they talk about that literal relationship and the connection as being the vehicle for change. And when I relate that back to DID and OSDD, the challenges that some therapists have in that, because they don't realize that they need to form a relationship with the parts.
Yes.
Right? Like stop asking one person to translate for the parts. They might not even have communication with all of their parts.
Right. And in Dissociation Made Simple, as you know, we went into talking to the contributors with a very open mind what was going to be revealed. And we asked them pretty standardized questions. And yeah, we've long intuitively known that therapeutic relationship is really where it's at. And we were really expecting them, the contributors, to give us some very direct answers on, no, this is what really worked for me. And even for contributors who did give a big shout out to things like EMDR or somatic experiencing or Reiki, the wider recognition was in, the bigger thing was in the person who was doing it, the person who was leading us through this healing journey, that connection with somebody who we felt got it, who didn't shame our parts, who was willing to learn, truly seemed to be the therapeutic imperative. The relational imperative is what a colleague of mine, Mark Dworkin, called it years ago. And I really stand by that. We really stand by that.
Your book, Dissociation Made Simple, has to be the best book out there on dissociation. So it'll definitely be linked in show notes for people. If you haven't read it, if you haven't read it, you absolutely should. It's so good. I think really helps people, especially those who have trouble conceptualizing it, can really get it.
I think people who have an open heart and an open mind to get it. Yes.
Fair point.
I think there's still a lot of more, but tell me exactly what to do, folks out there as clinicians, or more academic minds, more establishment minds who want to rip it to shreds for not being technical enough. At this point, we're tired of stopping. We are tired of pretending to write or even be a clinician just to make the clinical establishment happy. But we really feel that, we always go to Melissa's Parker, our friend, and their quote in there really, to me, amplifies why a book like Dissociation Made Simple is so important. And that is, our stories have been told by people who know nothing about us.
That is such a good quote.
It's my favorite quote in the book.
Yeah.
It's one of our favorite quotes in the book, but it's the one we often cite as, this is why we're doing this.
It's the controversy is just so interesting to me between those without lived experience and those with lived experience. And part of me is always like, why does that controversy even exist? We are absolutely stronger together. What's the threat?
We are. I think a lot of it's just that threat that whenever an expert group is called out on maybe your expertise isn't as important as you thought it was, I think that's part of it. Yet, let me give a little reflection here from the addiction field and coming up in the addiction field. Because 20 plus years ago, when I first got into that, I was having conversations around, does a person need to be in addiction recovery themselves to work effectively with somebody who is seeking addiction recovery? And my short answer is no, absolutely not. You can be a person without direct experience of having been treated for a substance use disorder, but I think there's a couple conditions that have to be present. You need to be willing to learn from the person who's sitting across from you. And I think part of it then is also recognizing, and this is a quote that some other recovery movements have popularized since, we're all in recovery from something. That yes, you may not have been somebody who's traditionally seen as an alcoholic that has a sober date and ended up in treatment, et cetera, et cetera. But if you can appreciate addiction as an attachment and life as something that needs recovered from in some way or another. So if you can look at those points of relation, and that's why in my dissociation made simple work and in a lot of the training I do, I want professionals to recognize where you have dissociated in your life, where you continue to dissociate in your life. That yes, it might not meet clinically significant thresholds, but if you can get honest about where dissociation's been a factor for you, even if it's that I get in my head too much, which is a form of dissociation,
Yep.
then I think you'll be in a better position to work with your folks. If you can get honest about your part system, your inner child, your protectors. And this is where, I mean, I don't think IFS is good comprehensive treatment for people with DID. I think it needs modified and updated for people with DID. Yet I do give Dr. Schwartz and the IFS movement credit for really popularizing this idea that we all have parts and all parts ought to be welcome. So I think that's part of the fissure as well and to go back to a point I made earlier in the interview, I think there is some legitimate fear that we won't be taken seriously if we don't take a more academic approach to this, because this whole thing just sounds so weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Okay, let me go there because yes, on the surface with the Western steeped scientific mind, trust nothing. Yeah, it sounds weird. But I say this because I'm an EMDR trainer. I trained you in EMDR.
Yeah, train me.
That one of the reasons Dr. Shapiro, the founder of EMDR, pushed for so much research. We got to research validate this, is because EMDR sounds weird on the surface, but only to like the Western scientific minds in which we now find ourselves. Because I have another article that's out there to holistic practitioners saying, stop saying you do weird stuff. Because when you do that, you're shaming indigenous approaches. You're shaming the roots of what healing really is about. And because all that seems weird to the Western psychological medical establishment as well. It's called alternative medicine. It's called complementary approaches, as opposed to these are the things that were around for healing since the dawn of time. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to some Native American, Native Canadian, and there's an Ecuadorian shaman who I interviewed for the book. Like, tell me what in your healing system, how you see dissociation and trauma. And I think anybody who's practicing today needs to learn from someone with a truly traditional approach to healing, meaning that predated Western psychology.
Agree. There are many paths to the top of that mountain. And the more open-minded we are, the more people are going to get to the top of that mountain.
And to that point, I even want to acknowledge, as much as you could obviously tell by talking to us, we can't stand the psychometrics like the multi-dimensional inventory of dissociation. Yet we will say, we're not absolutist. If one of our dissociative family members feels they need to take it to be validated. If they feel they need to see it in the numbers to get the insight, more power to you. For us, it makes us feel like a science experiment, and it was a completely frustrating experience having to take it. So yeah, there are many ways to the top of the mountain. I'm glad we're going there with this conversation.
I'm also hoping that people will take away from this conversation that the number on the mid or the DES, for example, can be pretty high. It doesn't mean you're not functioning.
Correct. Yeah, numbers only tell part of the picture, and not even to us the important parts. 9 made us get that in.
Thank you, 9.
9's like, we know Dr. Jamie Marich is trying to be polite, but yeah.
But you're right. There definitely are people that sometimes need to see it in black and white, and sometimes the numbers help them get there. Denial's pretty high, right? With when you live with this condition, sometimes whatever helps people land in the space that they need to land in order to take care of themselves and their system the best that they can, and whatever helps clinicians support them in doing that, as long as it's strength-based. So let's switch gears for a minute, because you are somebody who's written a lot of books.
We have.
You've got a brand new one hitting the press that I just started reading. Love it so far. You Lied to Me About God.
Sure. So You Lied to Me About God is my pure memoir that's coming out October 15th of 24. I say a lot of my other books have memoir qualities in them. They're memoir-ish. Like, you learn a lot of our story in Dissociation Made Simple and Trauma in the 12 Steps. Yet to write about spiritual abuse and religious trauma, which is a big part of our trauma narrative, we knew we couldn't do it unless we wrote it as a memoir, unless it was purely personal. And if you get some educational points from, because we obviously still share some fun facts throughout from the field and from literature, but we had to be personal about this. So we grew up, get this, our mother's Catholic. Our brother's actually a Catholic priest. And then when I was about 5, Dad converted to a form of evangelicalism represented by the kind of people who would picket pride parades, and just very, very hateful, very, God was like an abusive boyfriend in that faith. And we grew up with both churches. We literally went to both churches through our formative years. We would go to 9:00 Mass with Mom, and then Dad would pick us up, and we go to 10:30 Sunday school, and then later service with him. And it was a very confusing time, because so much of this particular evangelical church he was a part of was very anti-Catholic. And my mom stayed very resolved in her Catholic beliefs. And my parents had a lot of their other issues going on too. And then another form of our abuse is we were bullied at that Catholic school pretty significantly. And yeah, we're queer and feminist deep down, and a lot of our life was hiding that. And we knew probably in our late teens, we remember cognizing this term spiritual abuse. Like, this has to be what this is. I don't know if it's actually a real thing, but that has to be what this is, because a lot of our story was that our parents like fought for our allegiance to their particular faith traditions, not to mention using their religion and their versions of God. This was largely my dad who did that. Because in the memoir, we do talk a lot about what our mom did right in this upbringing, but a lot of ways she was still a product of her culture and her times. So yeah, You Lied to Me About God. And where the title comes from, since we were talking about shame in this conversation, one of our favorite quotes defining shame is from the feminist writer Anais Nin, saying, "Shame is the lie that someone told you about yourself. Shame is the lie that someone told you about yourself." And as we started really unpacking the impact that toxic faith and spirituality had on our mental illness and the development of our dissociation and whatnot, not only were we lied to about ourselves, we were lied to about ourselves in God's name. And a lot of the theology that we were raised in is just downright not true. It's an interpretation through the most hateful possible lens. And we really started to discover it as lies the more we met other people of faith who were not so hateful and not so extreme. And so thanks for giving us a chance to talk about that, because we're really happy to be sharing this even fuller expression of our lived experience with the world.
I'm excited that it's coming out. I feel like there are so many people that are going to benefit from it. When you think about your process of writing it, who are the groups of people that you most hope will read
It's a
it?
great question. I mean, our gut level answer goes to people in our queer family who, especially people in our queer family who still want some connection with God or spirituality. Because the other part of our story you'll discover in that is we're still a very spiritual person. We still identify as a person of faith. Because I think another huge lie we were told is that you can't be queer, you can't be a feminist and a Christian or a Catholic. And that's just not true. That's somebody's interpretation. So I also hope, I guess, on a larger scale, that people who are still seeking some kind of nourishment spiritually, but a big block has been everything they've been told in church or in God's name. I hope those folks read it too. And I also think in other audiences, if you just like an entertaining memoir, I think it was so one time when I told somebody, yes, we went to Catholic church and then evangelical service for the better part of our childhood. It was this sense of what? It's like, yeah, yes. I can't make this shit up. A lot of what I was exposed to in the churches. So I hope there's some whimsy to it as well, because we speak about this as a point in the book. Humor has been a very big part of our healing process, not just humor to deflect, but deep belly laugh humor, especially in contemplating just how ridiculous some of this was. We're even laughing now thinking about it. So we do hope that some of our affinity for comedy comes through in the book too.
I have no doubt. I'm not far enough into it yet. Cannot wait to finish it, to be honest. It is one of those books that you start reading and you don't want to put down, but then you have to do things like sleep and work.
Those are important. That's how we are with a lot of our reading and our writing too. Because even when you write, it could be just want to stay in this flow. And
yes,
my neck is crinkled and my back is hurting, and I better stand up for my own health and well-being.
Yeah, but you don't want to leave the flow because the flow feels good. Let's face it. Yeah, I'm hoping that lots of people will get some ideas for how to support themselves, especially if they are in the queer community and they've suffered spiritual abuse themselves. They have questions about themselves based on what they grew up with or what they were taught or what they're being subjected to right now today. It's such an important message. When I was growing up, there was a Baptist church that we used to go to, and my parents actually got divorced when I was about 5.5 because my mom is gay. And she started going to a church. I live in New England, so it's in the Boston area that was called MCC. It's the Metropolitan Community Church. And it was the most beautiful congregation. And it was so interesting as a child, because I got to go, that I always like to tell people I marched in my first gay pride parade when I was about 5.5.
Awesome.
I still remember the chants, but our household was subjected to a lot of hate. But that church was the most loving, accepting, fun place. And it stood in such stark contrast to what I had heard about the sort of fire and brimstone. You have to be a certain kind of person or you're destined for hell. And such a revelation as a young child to be able to see this loving church full of beautiful queer people worshiping together and having this understanding of a very loving God, a very different God from what I had been initially introduced to.
And we eventually found our way to those spaces, and they meant the world to us. And yeah, sometimes we can get into the, gosh, what if we were exposed to this as a kid? The reality is we weren't. And we've had a lot of grieving to do about that, and a lot of healing.
Yeah.
A lot of healing. Because I think the final point I'll end on is one of the reasons spiritual abuse or religious trauma can be so damaging. I'll just speak in general to folks like me, to folks like my system, is everything in me is wired for spiritual connection. My spiritual self is, just, yes. I can't even put words to it. And so when you mock that, when you shame that, when you belittle and say, no, how you're feeling the world spiritually is not how it really is. And then horrible things are said about you on top of that. Of course, it's going to hurt with more grip than some folks who are like, I've just never wanted to believe anything, or I have more of an atheistic or agnostic temperament, which is great because I don't force anything on anyone yet. I know, because some people laugh at me, everything you went through in the name of church, in the name of God, why do you still care? Because that's who we are. And
you point out everything you were taught was a lie.
Right. And we're happy because writing this memoir was, even after all the therapy we've had, was one of the most healing things we've ever done. And we know it's going to make some folks uncomfortable. And I encourage you to notice that, like we share in a lot of our healing practices, and because we were certainly put in a lot of uncomfortable situations for the better part of our early life.
Mm-hmm. Well, we will absolutely link.
Yes, that's anywhere you buy books. It's there for pre-order. Yeah, thank you.
We'll link a few. We'll link places where people typically buy books to make sure that's in the show notes. Strongly encourage people to pick up a copy. Cannot thank you enough for the conversation today. I think it's going to be really enlightening and helpful to so many people. Thank you. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having us.
We also want to say a heartfelt thank you to everyone who tuned in today to join us for this conversation. Thank you so much for being here and for your support. We will be sure to put some links into the show notes so that you can find Jamie on social media, so that you can find their books, as well as some of their other businesses and things that they are up to, so you can keep tabs on that. We hope that you found some good takeaways from the conversation today. And until next time, let's keep healing. Thank you for tuning in. You can find our blog on Substack at healingmyparts.substack.com and on Instagram at healingmyparts. Just a disclaimer, any information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for professional therapy or behavioral health care. Nor does listening to the podcast constitute a therapist-client relationship. Please be sure to take extra good care of you. And until next time, keep healing and thriving.